our very last panel of IMU, UR2. Oh, sad tears that this is the last panel, but we have a very exciting keynote after this at 7:30, so there's still so much to look forward to. I am so pleased to be serving as the respondent to our last panel on institutional interventions. If you haven't figured it out by now, my name is Aleesa, Alexandra, and I am the Robert M. and Ruth L. Halperin Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Cantor. Oh God. I swear to God, if I get one more round of applause for this, I'm gonna just crawl under this lectern. It is also my ultimate professional joy to co-direct the AAAI with my dear colleague, Marcy Kwan. Co-directing the AAAI these last few years with Marcy, who is my dear friend and collaborator, has been a great source of meaning for me in ways that I can't even begin to express. I think you'll hear more on this topic in the keynote, but female friendship does not often get historicized or spoken of as a site of creative, generative power, but it is, and it has been such a pleasure to be Marcy's colleague and her friend. So I am so thankful for that. I wouldn't want to do this project with anybody else. When Marcy and I first got the grant for this convening, we dreamt about who we wanted to get in a room together. And before I introduce our incredibly esteemed last round of panelists whose work I've admired for a number of years, I thought I'd invoke the title of a great body of work by Thai artist Rikrit Tiravanit, who asked the question, do we dream under the same sky? And these last 2 days, with this amazing group and all of you, I feel like we've been able to do just that. So, I am so pleased to welcome Alexandra Chang, Curator and Associate Professor of Practice at Rutgers University. Yes. Asma Naeem, Eddie C., and C. Sylvia Brown, Chief Curator at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Stephanie Syjuco, artist and professor of sculpture at UC Berkeley. And Christine Y. Kim, Britton Family Curator-at-Large, North American Art, the Tate Modern. Everyone's lengthy and very impressive full bios can be found in the QR code in the program or online. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call Alex to the podium. And remember, if you have questions throughout the panel, to write them down on note cards, and they will be picked up in the aisle, and we can address them during the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you so much. I just want to forward my slide, I think. Are the slides up, or? Oh. Fantastic. Okay, so thank you, Marcy and Aleesa, and Ellen and Eddie, and everyone for organizing this really important gathering. And congratulations on the initiative and the exhibitions. I'm really grateful to be part of this historic convening. I was thinking about IMU UR2 while preparing this presentation. I remember talking with Marvin Taylor, who was the director of Fales Library and Special Collections at NYU, about when he ran down to Martin Wong's apartment to bring his archives to NYU boxes at a time. He recognized the importance of Martin Wong's work and legacies on many levels as an artist and collector. He also recognized the importance of the 1980s downtown artists when others did not, and was pushing to preserve their archives and thus histories and providing access through NYU. I wanted to think about institutions and artist collections and what happens to collections when an Asian American artist passes away. This is a work by Nori Morimoto called Untitled from his City series, circa 2000, made of hard maple wood. The series references works which might suggest an approximation of a topographic mapping. You can see the blocks that might reference a cityscape. The photo is not a usual photo that you might expect, perhaps of an artwork. It's not on a wall or installed. It's not even all in the frame. The photo was taken by a student conducting an inventory during the shipment of work, examining the work for damage, measuring and documenting the work with another student, and you can see their knee in the frame. This work was from a donation by the estate of Nori Morimoto to the collection of Jack Chen, director of the Clement A. Price Institute, which was made available for loan to various spaces in the university at Rutgers University, Newark, where I work, including for my class, Global Asia's Art and Visual Cultures, to curate an exhibition at the main library, Dana Library. My class has been passed as a core class, then that means that I can teach it ongoing, but it also means that it's offered to students across the campus, from art history to dentistry to computer science and biology and beyond. And my students are mostly, predominantly, meaning usually over 90% BIPOC students, as Rutgers is really diverse. Some students detail for me excitedly about the shows that they've experienced that are going on. Others have never been to an art exhibition before. So we think about what has made them ever attracted to an exhibition or any sort of exhibition or festival or public program or a public space before, and what might have been welcoming. Why did they go there? Maybe why haven't they gone there? We look at their experiences and their points of view, and we think together how to engage audiences who may not be art historians or museum goers, and that engagements with art can have a variety of forms that are valuable in different ways to each person's experiences. What Marcy noted about working with actual pieces is so salient. Having the opportunity to work with a collection such as Morimoto's work was of exceptional value. The students have been able to work closely with the artwork, as well as archival materials on loan from the estate, and learn aspects of exhibition making, and have been able to speak to the daughter of the artist. We found that, similar to the Bernice Bing piece that Marcy mentioned as well, that, for example, this work, when you hold it, there's a cleat behind it, which you can't see here, but when you hold it, the long pieces are actually separated and they dangle, so there's actually motion in the work, and you would never know this unless you actually saw the work. And they were able to work with professional installer archivists, learning about cleaning, preparing the work, on designing walkthroughs, thinking about multiple narratives that can run through an exhibition. They conducted readings, research, introductory and didactic texts in collaboration with each other, and they're working on a tour together for the reception that will open the exhibition November 17th. And when they finish their class, they've curated an exhibition for the general public that's part of an active writing of active writing of an enmeshed art history and an active writing of a previously absented life's work. And as many of us know, there are very few texts and exhibitions on mid-century Asian American artists. The writing of this art history is not about inclusion. It's about reevaluating the shroud of systemic racism, the fundamentals of everything within the legacy structures that we're compelled to work with. We ask what is valued as worth taking care of iterating, of teaching, of how we do what we are doing going forward. It's not about siloing artists, again, through a telling about an art history within the context of a circumscribed and jargon-filled Asian American art history. It's about the work and life of the artist as presented itself to scholars, writers, curators, so that they have found that it is so compelling that they need to reiterate it. It may be a telling of a narrative of a specific focus or a work or trajectory or multiple contexts from which the artist has created. It may be about systems of racism that pervaded and continues to pervade the US and globally, that has caused, for example, his work to be out of view for so long and value his stories not to be considered for retelling for so long. It's a story of many facets and many tellings, and will be told certainly by a certain way by my students, and will hopefully be curated in different ways and written about in different ways to underline other aspects of the work and the artist's life upcoming. Morimoto was an artist born in 1931 in Manchuria when it was occupied by Japan. At a young age, he had a defiant personality. He moved from war-torn Japan to the US to become a designer in New York and started to work at Herbert Reed Design in the mid-1960s. He raised his family in Long Island and started one of the first Japanese restaurants there. He met and befriended artist Genichiro Inokuma, as well as George Nakashima and Isamu Noguchi. These artists became close and greatly influenced his practice. In 1987, Morimoto decided to purchase a former violin factory in the woods in Vermont. The studio was surrounded by trees and a stream and close to Camel's Hump State Park. In discussion with Noguchi, Morimoto was influenced by him to start and concentrate solely on his artwork and his art practice, and to concentrate on wood. This also meant that he left his family to go into the woods. He worked with many different kinds of woods, but also oftentimes with the wood that surrounded his studio, the trees. He would both meticulously plan out the works, ranging from wood panel pieces to freestanding sculptures to lamps and sconces, tables and stools. And he would let the wood tell him what to do, following direction of the wood, using the grain or the branches in the details of his work. But he would also create sketches in his workbook and of the pieces in advance, piecing them together like complex puzzle blocks. The earlier work brought in some color, usually using primary colors, but came to encompass black markings made by torching the wood or burning it through his own techniques using drills and saws, sometimes running backwards in unconventional and quite dangerous ways. His machinery was quite large, and the wood itself was overwhelming. He had no assistants, but cut and moved and sculpted the wood all by himself, and not being big in stature, he had to rely on physics, winter, snow, and ice to help him move the work and the wood himself. In 2016, he was diagnosed with dementia. He sadly passed away during the COVID pandemic in April 2020, during the time when we knew less about the virus, and many people, including Morimoto, passed away alone. His daughter Riza notes that while he passed alone, she was comforted to know that it was also reflective of his unique character, a man alone in the woods, or Morimoto, one from or who lives near the woods. As the daughter of the artist, Riza had an immense responsibility, like many artists from this time. These artists are either elderly or possibly already passed. So what happens is that their works are in archives are passed down to the families, and suddenly they're in charge of a legacy of works, in this case, 300 sculptural items and archival materials that they're not trained to handle or store. This is particularly the case of Asian American artists, who most of the time aren't collected by institutions already, so the works have a danger of being completely lost. When works are scattered and not collected and people have passed on, it becomes harder to locate items, archives, people who knew the artists, and even locating the existence of the artists themselves. What's lost is a generation of artists who were part of artist circles, movements, and were creating and showing exhibitions at the time locally, regionally, and globally. So simple, right? Institutions should help support these materials when they come along and provide access to these materials. But it's not easy to convince institutions to do so, especially in terms of Asian American art, when the artists aren't well known, and we all know why they're not well known, right? And so storage space is always at a minimum or not available. There are not funds to process the archives. Perhaps there are other institutions that can do so, like heritage museums, right? Nonprofit, minimally funded spaces, or other spaces, not ours, right? But it is, in fact, every institution's responsibility, as Asian American art is involved in multiple aspects of multiple issues, of multiple stories, of multiple narratives. It's enmeshed in world, national, and local histories and art histories and contexts. Also in the academy, of course, art can be taught in multiple departments, not just art history. And those deemed as Asian American artists are enmeshed within global art histories, global circulations, networks of artists, and as a part of what can be taught in multiple departments and across university silos. I'm thinking biology, environmental humanities, literature, urban planning, gender studies, sound studies, performance studies, just among them. So I was lucky at NYU to be able to work with some folks in the symposium like Margo Machida and also Mark Johnson, who I wanted to say is revolutionarily generous in everything that he does. I just have to mark that. And to think about artist archives, and collaborated on the East Coast Asian American Art Project with NYU and the APA Institute that helped to bring in several artist papers to fails with Marvin Taylor. But artwork was another story, and And it was just wonderful to hear about the Cantor's initiative, and also with other spaces like SAM with Melissa as well. And it's so needed. This is so needed. My students were surprised, but not surprised to learn about the predominant art history, that the predominant art history is one that is white and male, and that artists such as Ruth and Yasuo Kuniyoshi were refound. They were surprised, but not surprised, at the ways in which US modernism had been told, reading reviews and criticisms from the Times and noticing the purposeful exclusion and exceptionary and stereotyping language used. These things were obvious to them, obvious racism and missing histories, and this is interconnected, and that this is interconnected and enmeshed with a larger systemic and structural legacies. This is their lives, and they get it, right? And they understand it's absolutely ridiculous. That was what came up, the word ridiculous. This was the term used as they read these existing art histories. It's up to institutions to step up with collections and access for these students, scholars, and researchers. It's encouraging, and I'm optimistic to see these students excited about their points of view and these ideas of engaging with and how to engage with different audiences, coming to these stories and works and lives of artists, and what they're dying to get out in the world, right, with their voices, so that these important narratives and ideas can be told, seen, documented in multiple different ways, recognized of its value through their experiences and their positionalities as we move into the future. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I want to say what a distinct honor it is to be with my co-panelists. Truly a very special ending to an incredibly special convening. My thanks to the organizers and to everybody who's been here sharing in this incredibly collegial and warm atmosphere. I am Asma Naeem. It's a pleasure to be here with you. In this photograph, we see a man leaving his homeland as part of a massive refugee convoy. He's clutching his hookah and a wooden pole that balances a young boy swinging on one end and household belongings on the other. The year is 1947, and the man is part of the mass migration and bloody civil war triggered by what is now known as the partition of British India. Regrettably, this is a little-known history to this day. In the fallout from World War II, the British Raj, after 300 years of exploitation of natural resources and labor, after sowing internal strife among the native Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs for centuries, had decided to leave the country. A few months later, after fiery discussions about the creation of religious-based sovereignties, the separate states of Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh, were carved out of the Indian subcontinent. It would be an understatement to say that the cost of this colonial subjugation and recuperative efforts for nationhood by colonized subjects were staggering. The partition of British India displaced well over 10 million people. It led to over 1 million deaths, many more injuries, and generated the brutal and lasting legacies of hatred, trauma, and precarity that continue to define this part of the world today. The photographer of this image is not Indian, but an American woman, Margaret Bourke-White. Bourke-White began working as an industrial photographer and photojournalist, documenting one global crisis after another in such torrid conflict zones as Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. After Henry Luce hired her as the first female photographer for Life magazine, Bourke-White flew to India in 1946, 1947, and 1948 to document the crumbling British Empire and resulting strife in the subcontinent. She encountered famine, the assassination of Gandhi, mass migration, and the atrocities of war. But make no mistake, in this image we are beholders to her framing of a colonized subject. Thus, it is this, in one sense, another flattening of a being to victimhood, or is it? Is it a flattening of a being to victimhood that advances Western meta-narratives? One where the non-white subject is reduced to being a function of the white subject. What Homi Bhabha calls, quote, a rendering familiar to non-Indigenous audiences, end quote. Or is this an illumination, a signifier of the transnational histories of migrants, colonized, and political refugees? More fundamentally, is this documentary photograph a work that belongs in an art museum to tell these missing histories? As varying as these viewpoints seem, I ask us to hold these differing positions simultaneously, much like the man in this image balances his past and his present with his belongings on one side and his son, his future, on the other. And I further offer 3 points regarding how we in museums can deal with these narratives in our collection presentations. First, as this image suggests, migration is an inexorable fact of human history. And I would go so far to say that as museum professionals, we need to, in the words of Amar Mufti, refuse the chokehold of the nation state that has governed our discipline for centuries. More specifically, what if we reorganized our permanent collections away from the geographical and around this geopolitical assertion of migration, around the perpetual movement of peoples, whether the displacement is voluntary, forced violently, or somewhere in between? In her work on refugees and migrants, political theorist Salah Ben Habib makes a powerful plea, echoing Immanuel Kant, for moral universalism, and cosmopolitan federalism. She advocates for not open but porous boundaries and a recognizing of the admittance rights of refugees and asylum seekers. This philosophy sees individuals as human beings rather than as citizens of states. I would go so far as to say that it centers a humanity or a humanness, as I raise later in my talk, a relationality among humans despite ethnic or border specificities. For Ben Habib, migration is central to a totalizing theory of global justice, cascading from the Kantian right to hospitality that implored colonial powers to cede, an obligation to refrain from imperialist intrusions, and a right to provide safe haven for refugees. To date, museological approaches have repelled histories of migrations in collection installations, instead reinforcing normative orthodoxies and art historical taxonomies of geographies. In this day and age, when museums are in crisis, I ask how much longer the history of art as a European discipline and its value-laden taxonomies can be the governing paradigm. What if we, as museum professionals, looked at our collections with a sense of unfixedness, a destabilizing and, dare say, anti-enlightenment project of the chaotic, of heterogeneity? What if we build as an architecture of understanding our global histories of making and imagining as transcending borders? What if we build knowledge systems around transnational mobilities, around social histories, not based on shared coordinates, but on shared political agendas, or shared values of protest or social justice? Second point, the strikingness of this image, what Roland Barthes calls the punctum, is the little boy sitting in the balancing device the man holds. Life hangs in the balance, and there is a weight, a burden, but also the impossibility that migrants manage. I say impossibility in terms of trying to carry a home and a personal history on one's back, while also looking to a futurity with the promise of a next generation having a better life, seen in the seated boy. But let's read this image more allegorically and perhaps more boringly, if that's a word. For I see in this image, as a museum professional, a polarizing, a cleaving, however unintended, between the value of human beings on one side as articulated by the presence of the boy, and the value of objects and seen in the bundled items on the other side. This entails a constant toing and froing, a perpetual renegotiation of values and ethics for us as museum professionals, according dignity to those who need our care, whether they be artists or our staff. Museums for centuries, from Rome to Paris to New York, have traditionally been loci of displays of power, through looting and conquest, through the simultaneously valuing of objects and devaluing of humans. 3 examples of recent exhibitions at the Baltimore Museum of Art attempt to share these violent histories, this valorization of objects and goods over people and their dignity. Pakistani-American artist Salman Tour alludes to colonial greed and the violent imperialist encounter he encounters as a queer brown immigrant of the Anglo-Europeans in South Asia. In his lush, vivid paintings were piles of random objects, what he calls fag puddles, as an act of reclamation, and museum encounters ooze of dark comedy, mayhem, and suffering. Taiwanese-American Beatrice Glow critiques unresolved injustices wrought by colonial profiteering from the lucrative tobacco trade, weaving together tantalizingly decadent imagery to reveal the cascading impacts of capitalism and inequitable trade networks. And Filipino-American Stephanie Syjuco, here on the stage, drapes 5 historically charged 19th century objects from our museum's collection in a semi-sheer pixelated cloth to deny the power of display previously afforded to these objects of colonial empowerment. All 3 artists lay bare the irreconcilability between a global regime based on the circulation of objects and the profits thereof, and personhood, between the decay and the decadence that Asian and Asian Americans as colonial subjects have endured. They are not alone. Black and indigenous practitioners among many who have interrogated the relationship between the movement of objects and peoples include, among others, James Luna, Rose B. Simpson, David Driscoll, Betty Saar, Fred Wilson, David Hammonds, Maren Hassinger, and Baltimore's own Joyce Scott. So to all of you, I ask, what if we reorganize our collections not around such artistic styles as mannerism or modernism or minimalism, as Vasari or Berenson or Greenberg suggest, but around the political and social histories shared by makers across space and time? Third, and related to this framework of transnational migrations and social and political histories, we need to intertwine, one by one, the histories of collectivities across ethnicities and across identities. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his efforts to unravel the histories that have been trapped within European colonialism, wants us to develop, quote, other narratives of human connections where collectivities are defined neither by the rituals of citizenship nor by the nightmare of quote unquote tradition that modernity creates. Consider, for example, Indian artist Zarina, when she went to New York in the mid-1970s, when she sought out artistic communities, joining what is now known as Robert Blackburn's printmaking workshop and the faculty of the New York Feminist Art Institute. Zarina also became a member of the Heresies Collective, working on their special collections issue in 1977, Third World Women Artists, The Politics of Being Other. She worked on that with vastly divergent thinkers and makers, such as Howardina Pindell, Jean Quick-to-See Smith, Audre Lorde, Virginia Jaramillo, and Adrian Piper. So in closing, what if we look again at this image, not through the lens of post-colonial thinkers as Spivak or Baba, but through another lens of racial injustice and human rights? If I may be so bold, in her searching examination of the history of slavery in 19th century America, Saidiya Hartman describes Black Americans, quote, double bind of freedom, being freed from slavery and free of resources, emancipated and subordinated, self-possessed and indebted, equal and inferior, liberated and encumbered, sovereign and dominated, citizen and subject. What I suggest is that there's little distance between those enslaved, whether by those in the American South or those in the British Raj, and that is because of this common thread of forced migrations and hegemonic regimes, of Anglo-Europeans that we all need to illuminate and dismantle. Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter posits that colonial modernity has prioritized the European man as a model of humanity. Instead, Wynter argues that we need to give humanness a different future, and that our current systems of knowledge cannot hold the changes that are occurring and are arising. It is this humanness, this interconnectedness, that I urge all of us as thinkers and makers to recover, nurture, and reshape. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Syjuco. What an honor it is to be here in the company of so many artists, scholars, and curators under the umbrella of the Asian American Art Initiative. My recent work focuses on the problematic construction of American history and how photography informs deeply biased structures foregrounding whiteness as a normative subject. Borrowing from the visual language of photography, anthropology, and museum archives, I examine how these disciplines go hand in hand with producing and proliferating images and documents of exclusion, generating a skewed collection that mirrors an American imagination built on white supremacy, ethnographic record, and cultural othering. I do not make work about Filipino identity. I make work about the white gaze, and those are two totally different things. Over the past 4 years, I've used national archives and collections as visual source material for an investigation into the presence or non-presence of Filipinx Americans in these spaces. It's a simple query. Where are we? And what do we look like within these American archives? Where are we not? Where are we accidentally? Where should we be? Searching through an archive's documents and photographs to find evidence of one's cultural lineage and existence, it becomes clear that the archive is not built for us. It's American colonial subjects. And when the archive is about us, it shows a frightening lack of clarity. If we were to take these archives as extensions of the American imagination, then that imagination is full of blind spots, holes, and fragments. We are seen, posed, and framed on the margins. For a project at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis in 2019, I spent weeks investigating archives at the Missouri Historical Society and the St. Louis Public Library in order to view the ethnographic photographs produced from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Heralded at the time as a marvel of American progress and abundance, the fair also featured the notorious Filipino village, a type of ethnographic human zoo that actively displayed over 1,200 imported Filipinos in an unfaithful recreation of ritual and tribal spectacle. This functioned to educate the American public on their new colonial subjects, as the Philippines had become a U.S. colony in 1898 and would continue under American rule for almost a half-century. The overwhelming amount of demeaning and racist imagery produced just at the fair circulated and became the most widely known representations of Filipinos in the American archive. These pictures are everywhere and are not countered. They travel through time and keep on giving over 100 years later. Now picture this. 2 brown-skinned hands come together to cover a small, grainy, black and white photograph in such a way to block out most of a scene. Around these hands, we can make out parts of the people they are covering. A group of dark-skinned men in tribal costume, their bare legs and feet standing next to spears as if posed for a picture. Their faces and identifying features, however, are covered by the hands, my hands, as if to keep them anonymous and protected from a public that had put them on display. It's a curious rephoto that shows and doesn't show at the same time. It withholds and denies and attempts to frustrate the viewer in the act of looking. It's one of many, many similar instances in which I physically used my hands to cover and edit the images of Filipinos put on display at the fair. I sat in the archives and systematically intervened in their pictorial delivery system. The final work of covered photographs is called Block Out the Sun and was my way of talking back to the dehumanization of this archive. Not long after, I was deep in the Archive Center at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, having received a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship to do a month of study, again looking for evidence of Filipinos in a national archive. Again, I wasn't interested in a heritage study where I would find cultural connection with my identity. I was attempting the opposite, which was to see how the empire sees us. Search after search turned up fragments, bits, and incomplete evidence, as if the only way we could make it in was through ethnographic photo, war document, or accidental inclusion. At one point, I found so few records outside of these spheres that I started typing in peripheral terms like Oriental. Yes, there is an archive folder labeled that, and misspelled versions of Philippines and Filipino into the search engines, anything to get a different hit. And as my frustrations grew, the field of searches grew, the search terms getting wilder and more abstract in order to find something. And so the searches took me into the business records of the Duncan Yo-Yo Company, which weirdly enough had one of the largest collections of images of Filipinos, men who had been brought over in the 1920s and 30s as traveling salesmen to hawk yo-yos to the general public. In the anthropology archives, I found a labeled file of photographs of Filipino Tasaday tribespeople mixed in with a South American Amazonian tribe, which had somehow accidentally migrated in and become one and the same in the eyes of the archivists. There, I also found an image of Philippine national hero Jose Rizal, labeled simply with the generic term man, and in handwriting on the side, a quizzical Philippines? The hard truth was that the empire, despite owning us for half a century, still did not recognize us. The colonial legacy of the ethnographic image was still the primary lens, along with mislabeled files, untagged records, dead ends, and fragments. What do you do with erasure, disintegration, and obfuscation? How can we re-envision, assert, and insert ourselves when left out of the original national narrative? I'll end with this image on screen. It's my own artwork, so bear with me. I'm an artist, so I'm a bit obsessed with the things I've just worked on. It shows a black and white photograph of a group of Filipino women in traditional dress, dancing and joyful. It's one of the best images I could find in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History that depicts us. It's an anomaly, a blip, a beacon, a light. I was stunned when I found it. It was so different from all of the other images of us. It sits in an archival storage box, and the caption for it explains its origin. Nationalities, 11 Filipino women in native dress from the American Counterpoint Project, Alexandra Sr., photo prints circa 1940, National Museum of American History, Archive Center, NMAH.AC.0204. The lengthy title of this artwork places it within a specific index of an American archive. You can track it back. The call numbers show the images being officially logged into a shelf of history, a moment where these women can be called forward to and attest to their presence in a sea of non-representation. If we look closer at this image, we can see that it's actually a picture of a taped-together picture. The original photograph by Alexander Sr., sitting in a box on a table, was photographed by myself and blown up and printed in pieces as low-resolution laserjet prints, complete with cut edges and overhanging paper margins. These pieces were then literally scotch-taped together into a giant poster, pinned to my studio wall, photographed yet again, and then finally printed as a high-resolution, large-scale archival print and framed. It's a reproduction that has gone through multiple processes of reproduction, from low resolution to high resolution, from the belly of the archive buried and forgotten in boxes and stacks, and then finally formatted as a new art object. And it has also recently been acquired by the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, having migrated out of an archive box from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, originally as a work by Alland, a documentary photographer, and retold as an artwork by me, a Filipinx American speculating on her own place within a national narrative. I see this swapping of origins and histories as a form of regeneration, a nod to the legacy of Alexander Alland, a Ukrainian-born Jewish refugee whose life's work included documenting immigrant communities in America to counter rising xenophobia. His picture, reflecting us, brought me profound light, and I, in turn, bring to it light 80 years later through reproduction, compressing time and distance between us. Together we get to sit in solidarity as dual authors in a new spotlight, not hidden anymore in a dusty box, as it will be on display in the Smithsonian galleries sometime next year. And just yesterday I did a search through the Smithsonian online database for the term Filipino American, and I found myself in the archive through this new old work, clearly labeled. It is object number 2022.24.1. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I am so honored and humbled to be here with these esteemed panelists and all the participants today. Before I begin my time, I just wanted to express my support for and solidarity with the women and the people of Iran. And I want us to thank you. I also challenge us, I'm channeling Edward Said here, to think about Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and this part of the world as West Asia. I think we often refer to this part of the world as the Middle East. We think about Far East, Near East, and to think about this terminology as very Eurocentric. Of course, those words only apply if you're in Europe. But as we talked about geographies yesterday, Europe and Asia are one continent. And if we think about those areas, perhaps West Asia, it brings up a whole other layer of questions. So just to kind of throw that out there, something to think about. One other thing before I start my time, as Aleesa introduced me, I am I'm the curator of North America for Tate Modern, but that is a new job. And just to give you a little context for my presentation, before that, I was a curator of contemporary art at LACMA, and I'm going to talk about my last show there. And prior to that, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and my area of specialization is African American art. Okay, so the way I'm going to structure my talk today is around a question and then in a bit of storytelling. So the question is, how can an equity model for an exhibition on African American portraiture during a global pandemic and a racial reckoning, which I will discuss today, be a kind of case study or proposal for Asian American exhibition making and institutional interrogation? So with that, institutional interventions is the topic here. And we're going to rewind to pre-pandemic. I know our brains are a little bit like, when? 2019, 2020? But this is fall 2019. And I was asked by my then director, Michael Govan at LACMA, to curate an exhibition to coincide with the Obama portraits that were coming to LACMA as part of a 5-city tour that was then extended, portraits by Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald. And I started combing through the collection at LACMA, starting with a 1790 portrait of Paul Cuff, who was an African-American sailor. He was freed. He lived in New England. After the War of 1812, he sailed families back to Sierra Leone. He knew the trade winds. He was a whaler sailor, had amassed a fleet of ships, knew the trade winds to the Caribbean, black captains, black crews, quite an extraordinary story. There are photographs by Roy de Carava, works by Charles White, but it was certainly an uneven display. And I thought to myself, okay, we can borrow some works, create a portraiture exhibition to sort of complement the Obama portraits. And then fast forward about 7 months, March 2020, right? COVID hits, we're all in isolation. Government officials are not only perpetuated, but creating a narrative of Kung flu, Chinese flu, putting many East Asian looking people at risk. Assaults, the isolation of COVID revealing the gravest racial inequities with Black, Brown, Indigenous, Pacific Islander people, revealing disparities in health care, in death, in illness, and of course, the anxiety, the depression, the rage. And then a few months later, then we have May 2020, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police, sparking the largest protest movement in the US. And in this time, of course, we think about, if we can rewind and think back, our mobile devices become everything. I mean, our kids are going to school on iPads. It's how we're getting our news. It's how we're communicating with our families who are living far away. It's really like our umbilical cords to the rest of the world. And an article in the New Yorker by Elizabeth Alexandra comes out that really struck me, called The Trayvon Generation, which has later become a book. It came out a few months ago. And in it, she talks about the impact on younger on Black youth, and kind of the re-traumatizing effects of these images and this footage of Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck, of Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, these narratives, these images playing over and over and over again. And while, of course, body cam footage, bystander footage has been a resource, to prove the violence that has been inflicted on Black and brown bodies, it also has this effect of re-traumatizing young people. And so I start thinking, and at the same time, of course, we all remember museums are making these huge missteps, you know, these social media posts standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and artists are calling these museums out saying, well, you know, okay, you're in solidarity, but what are you actually doing? What does this actually mean? You know, are you performing? What was this kind of virtue signaling that's happening here? And so I started asking myself, as a curator working on this exhibition, how could this exhibition that I had already started working on, Black American Portraits, actually create change and not just sort of perform solidarity? Can exhibitions create change beyond just being a great show that I really enjoyed, that had an impact on me? I'm interested in this artist, I want to research this further, but really deeply in a social way and in terms of a consciousness in a wider, kind of accessible way for a wider audience and community and public that makes one think about art differently in this way. And what is a museum's responsibility, especially during times of social upheaval? Check my time. How can a museum counter, challenge, and disrupt the fetishization, commodification, spectacle, and consumption of Black pain and trauma? And then I started thinking, well, what if we flooded the public with images of Black joy, love, subjectivity, and abundance? And what if hope and joy can be a form of resistance, refusal, and a way that an institution can be kind of, this can be a sort of action. Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, professor of Black Studies at UCSB wrote that the history of African American portraiture is a history of absence. And I thought to myself, in this moment, it felt that African American portraiture, this history felt amplified by a history of violence, a history of erasure, a history of re-traumatization, a history of driving home that museums are spaces where you may be fetishized as object, but you may not be the subject, I. And this is something that Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrill often talked about growing up, especially Kehinde growing up in Los Angeles, that he went to the Huntington and LACMA and museums and never saw images in the artwork of people who looked like him. And so, so here we go. This is a slide. I cheated and put a few images on the slide. And the show ended up being 140 works of art covering 200 years of African American portraiture. And so I pivoted from this portraiture show centering to really center social, emotional, historic, cultural subjectivity in this specific selection of abundance, of Black abundance, subjectivity, and joy here. And then more questions came up, and it sort of didn't end there. It really, like how to go deeper into this. These questions of equity started coming up because this wasn't good enough for me. How not to be performative, like putting pictures of diverse work on the wall, how to really, really commit. And the answer is, of course, the collection, right? Like a lot of museums, LACMA doesn't have an endowment for acquisition. So, you know, one really needs to ask for donations, one needs to fundraise, ask for gifts of work in people's collections. So the fundraising started there, calling people who supported the museums, who had posted on their social media, I stand in solidarity. Well, I also know that you own, you know, a work by Ming Smith. I also know that you own that. You know, it's time to stand up. And what's so amazing that happened was people really did because they saw that the museum was taking action. So this is what I think about, like a 360 action, and I'm talking about Black collectors, non-white collectors, you know, white collectors, really across the board, patrons who had been committed to the museums, patrons who are new to the museum, BIPOC collectors who had felt alienated by the museum previously, who had felt invisible and unwelcome by the museum for very good reason historically. I also want to point out Jenny King is here, who is sort of my partner in crime in this project, who really worked on this with me. And after nearly 2 years, we raised $7 million worth of art for the collection without an endowment. And I'm really not saying that to like pat myself on the back, but really to express that that action begets action here. And that when a museum really steps out, says, we're gonna do this, and this is what commitment looks like. It's not just performing this, putting this up on the walls, but we're bringing it into the collection so that your great grandchildren have this work in the collection to study, to put back on the walls. Their work by Amy Sherald, McLean Thomas, David Driscoll, Buford Delaney, John Biggers, and many, many more. In fact, work by a former art handler, Cedric Adams, who had worked there for nearly 25 years, and a bunch of people on staff donated $50, $5, $100, and together we pulled money together to buy his work and put it in the exhibition. So this idea of seeing oneself is really important. And then, again, going a bit deeper, how do we do this on the exhibition fundraising, the exhibition support model? Because this always has to be done with an exhibition. You know, who's going to pay to put the work on the walls? And so I don't know about you, but when I go to see an Asian exhibition, my hope is that I see last names on that support wall, you know, that you see right next to the logos and the exhibition description, like Gupta, Seng, Wu, Lee, Tanaka, Reyes, Nguyen, Kazan, Faruqi. I want to see names like that when I go to an Asian exhibition. But the truth is, it's more likely Rockefeller, Crow, Judah, Brundage, etc. And it's fine to have a mix, but you know, there's an equity piece around that. It's not just the artists, and it's not just the staff. So what could a new model for fundraising be, this 360 approach in terms of equity, not to perform diversity? And there's a calculus here, right? So if you need a certain amount of money for an exhibition, you can go to 5 people and ask for $50,000, or you can go to 50 people and ask for $5,000. Because the truth is, in terms of the economics of where people are, if someone has been feeling alienated by an institution, but they may have the means, you need to start with an amount that feels appropriate for them. So this is sort of the calculus here. It's the same idea of, you know, 100 people at a private country club versus 10,000 people who can swim at a public pool. 5 kids who go to Stanford versus 5,000 kids who can go to community college. You know, these types of metrics, how do we infuse that into a public institution? So breaking those down, I don't have much time here, but I think it just takes work on our behalves. I think in this case, it takes diversity within a development and advancement department to be able to speak to and understand those types of, that type of language, that type of approach, and the culture within these communities. And I also want to state that this is not some like radical change that, oh, you know, we can all like pat ourselves in the back and go home. This is like a very precarious state. This is something that happened for one exhibition and one instance, and is still an unstable, you know, I don't know, I'm not at the institution anymore, but is something that one needs to continue to work at. It's a structural model that was introduced in this instance, but one that I hope can become something, of course, for different types of exhibitions, different types of institutions would need to look different, but have a bit more kind of permanence or solidity, or at least within an institution can be revised and applied more frequently. So I will end there. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just offer some reflections on this last panel and these last couple of days, and then make sure to write your questions on the card so that we can address them shortly. So, you know, through these last couple of days, and especially with regard to this panel, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of relevance. What does it mean for a topic, a field, or category like Asian American to become relevant in the public eye? What are the stakes and the underlying implications of such a declaration? And what does relevance mean? I think I can confidently say that for many of us in this room, it has been a complex combination of bittersweetness, anger, despair, and hope that our lives and experiences as Asian Americans have become increasingly relevant these last couple of years. Relevant because why? Because there has been an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes directed at us in the wake of COVID-19? Because xenophobia is ever rampant? Why does it seem like, as Marcy has written, a racialized subject is only worthy of regard in relation to white supremacy? I can't tell you the number of times supposedly well-meaning members of the art world tell me how lucky Marcy and I are to have launched the AAAI during this cultural moment. They would lament that their work on early modern European art or canonical American modernism no longer seems relevant anymore, and what a shame that is. Those of you who work on minoritized, or more accurately, global majority art, probably know these comments very well. These types of comments imply that Asian American art matters now only because our collective survival is more visibly under threat. To me, the idea of relevance implies that we should be grateful for the attention Asian American art and Asian Americans are currently receiving. And Dorothy reminds us just how wary we should be of gratefulness. Grateful to whom and to what, and who gets to decide what is relevant or not. Relevance also implies scarcity, that there is only so much attention in the world to be given, and that at certain times some things are relevant and not others. When it comes to the racialized subject, this implication is a tactic of white supremacy, a way of pitting historically excluded communities against each other so that we might fight for the mantle of relevance at any given moment. It suggests that space is being ceded to us for a brief period, and it will eventually be given back to its rightful holders. Relevance is a word often weaponized against us. It begs the question, were we irrelevant before this moment? To be clear, Marcy and I started working on the initiative long before the Atlanta spa shootings, or the pandemic, or its increase in racial violence. In fact, our work was not and has never been about appealing to the fickleness of relevancy. This work has been and will always be important to us, no matter where the tides of attention may turn. How then should we grapple with relevance in relation to art institutions? All of us on this panel work within powerful institutions of higher education and culture. Each of us must confront the questions: is the work that we are doing relevant? And what do art institutions, archives, and universities owe historically excluded communities? Most of the institutions in which we exist were not created to support us or people like us, just the opposite in many cases. In fact, Asian Americans have historically thrived outside of art institutions and made spaces and collectives on our own terms. And I think we've seen that over these last couple of days, because of course I'm thinking of Kearney Street Workshop, Godzilla, the Asian American Women Artists Association, and many other organizations that have preceded the AAAI. In turn, institutions have often made themselves irrelevant to diverse communities, our ivory towers and classical facades serving as figurative and literal barriers to entry. Institutions also have a way of traumatizing or re-traumatizing the historically marginalized. Archives, while repositories of selective forms of information, are not neutral sites of engagement. It is in archives where we confront the horrors of omission, misdocumentation, and violence. How might we tend to archival histories in ways that foster narratives beyond our traumatic pasts and promote other affective modes of engagement? As is often the case, artists show us the path forward, as Stephanie's work clearly demonstrates. How can we address the failures of history while also bringing joy and belonging into the present? Once again, Stephanie's practice shows us ways institutions can provide frameworks to address their own shortcomings. As one of our esteemed keynote speakers, Kathy Park Hong, writes, that to live an ethical life is to be held accountable to history. I think this is an excellent personal and professional mantra, one that can work distinctly well for museums and institutions of higher learning. Christine and Alex's presentations show us how being ethical, generous, and accountable to community and history can help envision new possibilities, to think between, beyond, and within gallery walls, to restructure the behind-the-scenes work. Christine reminds us of all the work that Black scholars, artists, and curators and their allies have done to create the field of Black art history for themselves. And through their example, may we learn not only how to build our field, but form interethnic, intergenerational collectives. Asma's talk shows us the distinct difficulty of the field of Asian American art has faced from its inception, the constraints of taxonomy and geography, especially as it applies in the museum space. How does migration, as an organizing principle, challenge our work as curators? Museums, with their specific geographical and chronological categories, often reinforce problematic nationalist and isolationist boundaries. which, as we all know well, artists do not obey such classifications. I work at what is called an encyclopedic museum, and like so many, I am skeptical of such a museological mode of organization with its tidy and misleading boxes that more often than not seek to reduce meaning rather than to enhance it. If we are to understand and explode Asian American as a category within institutions, reminding ourselves that the term was created in 1968 as a political gesture, we must recognize the interconnected nature of our collective history. That the arrival of some of the first Chinese migrants to the United States to do the hazardous, backbreaking work of building the railroads was connected to the displacement of indigenous peoples. That Japanese American farmers made a significant portion of the agricultural workforce in California prior to World War II, and during incarceration, Mexican workers were brought in to attend to their absence. That in Berkeley, Asian American student activists marched alongside Black Panthers and other community organizers in the late 1960s, leading to the establishment of the first ethnic studies programs in universities. Only with this knowledge can we begin to understand what possibly constitutes Asian American. This convening is helping Marcy and I think through the future of the AAAI. This project is not about carving out small temporary spaces for Asian Americans in the museum, but thinking through how we can re-envision, rebuild, and even tear down institutional structures that have done little else but exclude and oppress. Asian Americans should not feel like we need to argue for our existence in museums. Rather, museums and institutions should feel grateful when historically excluded communities show up and support their spaces. Because that is an act of faith, generosity, care, and sometimes even forgiveness, though I do not mean to suggest that forgiveness is something that should be expected or even granted. I know I've been a little polemical in this response, but it comes from a place of hope and possibility, a place of love, really, for this group, for this occasion, and this opportunity to speak frankly with all of you among this extraordinary crowd. Here's what I'd like to think through with this panel. What does the future look like for us beyond this moment? What kinds of things can we think about creating together, and where should we be investing our time and resources? I want to know what lessons everyone has learned along the way, and what they want all the students in the audience to know going forward. We're the last panel of the day before our incredible keynote with Kathy Park Hong, Jen Liu, and Marcy Kwan. What will each of you leave here thinking about?
All right.
Thank you.
Well, okay, so the part of the title of this panel, the word institutional is in there, right? And then it's intervention. And so there's this idea, right, that here's this thing, we're all in it now, and we're supposed to go like this. Right? Something like that. And then I guess something that was brought up in other panels was like, well, you know, there's so many other contexts apart from the institution. So that's literally to place oneself on the outside of it on purpose because the institution is itself a kind of limitation, right? But for those that find ourselves in it, then the question is, all right, well then how far are we willing to go? And what does that look like? Or what is even legible? Because I think sometimes when you try to change an institution, it fights back. So in my own experience, I've found that the things that I do that are the most effective are the things that I'm actually silent about until it's too late. And so, you know, when this image goes into, one area of the Smithsonian from another one, that, you know, that intention wasn't necessarily spelled out, but you have to play it really, really well in order to kind of like get some things done. So I just want to throw that out there. Like, what do we mean by intervention, and is it even legible?
I'll go next just to fill the silence, even though my idea is a little premature. But it's something around we all hold these soft powers that exist every day that are invitations to insert ourselves in these conversations. Because some like weird kind of racist moment can also be a kind of moment to turn something around and in a way to, you know, to bring up something that can lead to something, that can lead to something else, that can become an institutional intervention. And maybe not in that way, like, oh my God, there's like, the museum has a new director and everything is changing, but like in that way that then that other thing connects with that other thing and it becomes this kind of rhizomatic, you know, like, and it's invisible, but it's happening. And I think that that's, for me, why I have always, in the 20, I wouldn't give away my age, but you know, something years of doing this, that I've always worked, you know, full-time at an institution, but I founded, you know, co-founded several nonprofits like LAND, Los Angeles Nomadic Division, that does temporary exhibitions around LA, Gyopo, which is a diaspora Korean organization in Los Angeles, Stop Discrimination that, you know, during the pandemic. I mean, just been involved, you know, on the advisory group for Denniston Hill, which supports many queer artists of color working in choreography and dance, because I think that, you know, we all have our own platforms. And if there's a way that I can use a platform that I have institutionally, you know, and these other spaces, non-institutional, community, advocacy, activists, you know, whatever they might be, that they're like diagonal connections that we all have, that you don't have to be an institutional person to connect those things, because you may be adjacent, you might be sitting right next to someone, you know what I mean? So anyway, those things are perpetual, coexistent, diagonal, not always, you know, vertical, hierarchical, so that to just, you know, have that we all have our kind of awarenesses, you know, our kind of tentacles, you know, up and you know, being aware of those opportunities, whether just in conversation or in institutional or potentially, you know, potentially charged institutional ways that may lead to in these kind of dynamics. And I think that's something that Asian immigrants, you know, that, you know, most of us come from war, refugee, you know, colonial, these pasts, and don't necessarily, you know, think have been kind of taught, you know, whether it's through the trauma, through the messaging, through the internalized stuff, you know, are able to do that, or it takes a couple generations to kind of interrogate that and kind of flip that inside out, but to just, you know, I mean, I think that this symposium, I think, has been great, certainly for me, to take that one step deeper and sideways in other directions.
I mean, I think I'm just going to kind of come off of what you're talking about and finding these spaces that are, you know, not of the institution, but that you're part of the institution, because I find myself always doing inter-institutional projects. Like, that's what I do, because I find the space in which you can, you know, bring people together to create networks of support, which is so needed, mostly in our field. But also, it's a very open space, and people are doing the most cutting-edge things because it's a little more experimental. It's not siloed, right? Because that's what we find, like, always hitting ourselves against, this idea of, like, what your space is supposed to be doing, what you're supposed to be teaching. And I wanted to think, like, coming out of the the conference, like, and mostly this panel and what you were saying, Aleesa, really had me thinking about how I teach Asian American art. Because I teach it under a rubric of global Asia's art and visual cultures, and that's not by chance. I mean, there's certain reasons that I wanted to use this notion of the global, obviously circulations, but also opening up comparative diasporas, but also the positioning of having, you know, this long history of Asian American art being siloed in itself in being seen as parochial and not worthy. And so in the development of terminologies of explaining what the hell I'm teaching, it's been like Asian diasporic art, transnational, like all these, and it's political in the way that it was named Global Asia's Art and Visual Cultures and why these things happen. But of course I have this interest also. But then in teaching Asian American art, the relevancy is really interesting because we were all really fucked over by the European modernity that was spread globally. I mean, we're going through the legacy of all this, right? And this is what we're going through in terms of decolonizing collections, rethinking the institution, structural, racism within the institution in the way that it's built fundamentally, as well as collections and the academy. I mean, this is what we're all pushing back, but I think I find in Asian American art, in teaching it, the ability to iterate how, the European model of modernity that has, within it extractivism, othering, all these things that have created like climate change, like everything that we're fighting, how it becomes clear to my students, like the discourse building, all the structural building of this, and why we're where we're at, and how we can completely rethink, therefore, how to go about now. Like, you have a chance. You have, like, now that we look through these lenses, through the help of Asian American artists, through interventions in the archive, all these different things that Asian American artists are doing, or artists that, perhaps it's not, talking about being Asian American, but really kind of, because of these specific categorizations that comes from this history of categorization and othering, we realize now, these structures and how we can not only dismantle, but just like, we know the history and it will always be there, but what can we do other? How, through your experience, as I was saying, my students are mostly BIPOC students, through your experience that we're going to valorize, how are you going to go about and do the work that you're going to do?
Hi. I feel like I need to talk because I'm the last person who hasn't talked. But I am actually going to take it in a very different direction in terms of what I'm leaving this extraordinary conference with. And that is the personal. What I have been struck by over and over and over again is the number of inflections of autobiography that have been shared generously and with grace through all of these presentations. The ways in which that inflects not only a choice of aesthetics or a choice of art historical methodological approaches, but also a way of sharing knowledge with the world. And for me, that sense of the personal is something that I did not realize I needed as an art historian. You are taught to depersonalize. You are taught to extract your background. You are taught to approach this field from an objective positionality. And as all of these presentations, as these artists, these incredible artists that we've heard from throughout the past 2 days have shown us, the only way in which we can change and move is to start from within and share what's in within, because that's what's the most meaningful to us, and that will move others.
I completely agree, Asma. I was struck by the same thing, and in the number of ways in which people were extraordinarily vulnerable and generous in sharing that thing which so many of us were taught not to share. And Marcy and I talk about this a lot, in that neither of us have had training in Asian American art or this field, and frankly that was, one, not really something that was accessible or available to us, which is part of the conceit of this project, but two, you, or at least I, was worried that throughout a graduate program you wouldn't be taken seriously if you were to study something related to your own identity. And so that in order to be taken seriously as an art historian, you had to study something unrelated to you. And I think one of the great things that this convening has shown us is the incredible criticality and value that reflection and self-reflection can bring when you are taking that into your practice, because to be an intelligent person is not separated from being an emotionally intelligent person, right? And so I think that so much of that has been revealed to us here, especially through the artists, because like artists always know the way, they always know what's up, and we're the ones that are just trailing behind, like, teach us, teach us. But on the notion of teaching us, I am very conscious that we are at a teaching institution here, and I'm conscious of the students in the audience, and I'd love to ask each of you with your long and wonderful careers what thoughts or advice you might have to give the young folks who, God help them, think about entering institutional work or working in museums or archives or teaching. And this is a wonderful group here. I think we can be frank and generous in our responses. So what do you have to say to them? Because I often try to search for what I should say to them in my own work.
All right, well, I'm a professor,
Yes.
so hi, everybody. I tell my art students this, so I work with a lot of young art students. I was also once a young art student myself, actually in the early 90s, right? So that was during the first sort of like wave of, a kind of promotion of identity politics, and I feel like we're being asked to go, that's happening again for various reasons. And I try to tell them, actually, despite the demand for representation, because I think that's what a lot of collectors are looking for. I think that's what a lot of the museum public wants, which is a kind of almost pedagogical and inviting representation of one's ethnic background or identity. I would just suggest to resist it, because that's a kind of performance that actually is in really high demand right now. So the more that you can be completely like, contrary in your actual personhood to what is expected of you, no matter what your background is, I think that's like, please, do that. Because I think too, there's along with a kind of profile of Asian American, there's also this kind of like, this circle being drawn around what that can look like. And, young students might try to aim for that, thinking that that's how they're going to gain, into the conversation. So just throwing it out there.
I guess I'm somewhat hesitant because it's like, I don't think you should follow me as a model, because I think working as a curator today or starting as a curator today looks very, very different from how it did 20 plus years ago when I started. My first museum job was in the bookstore at the Whitney. I don't have my PhD. I didn't do the Whitney ISP program when everyone was doing it in the 90s and I was in New York. I was playing in an all-girl punk band in Brooklyn. Like I was on the Lower East Side. Like it was not, and I was just making shows in garages, and like it came out of music. It came out of like all these different places. It was like BIPOC friends and queer. I mean, it was not, and you could do that. I mean, people like some of the people I've learned the most from, Thelma Golden doesn't have a master's or a PhD. Franklin Sermons, Michael Govan studied to be an artist. I mean, Oakley got his degree in political science. I mean, it's like, but I think that looks really different today. So I think that, now it's like professionalized. You do a curatorial program, you do this, and I've mentored some of the young people who've come through these programs, and some of them are great, and some of them kind of baffle me. I think it's a really difficult degree, but profession. But I do know it's a difficult one, and it's one that is as people of color, that the whiteness that exists in institutions is pervasive. It continues to be, and it's very challenging, and it's very easy to go another route, and it's a choice that one needs to make. If you to stick with it and to be in that space. You might be my age and still making a 5-figure salary, and there are big choices to make, and I think that I was having a conversation yesterday, like maybe we don't want to be part of the canon. Maybe there's something interesting about like turning the canon sideways. What is the canon? Implode the canon, explode the canon. These other types of questions that are out there. An artist, curator, artist, one goes first, and there are other modes of being, but then there's the practicality, well, how do you pay your bills, So I think it's a too complicated a question for me to really address in this panel, but I'll leave it at that.
Are we doing on time, Marcy? We're okay? Wait, was that 5 minutes? Okay. So how about I just combine our most incisive questions and pose them to you so that we may discuss them. What is the price for Asian American visibility in your institution or artistic community? What is the price for Asian American visibility? I'm just going to give you guys the fun ones. Fundamentally changing the institution. Change how? From within, take over, or burn it down and start again.
I don't know. I'll start. I think. I mean, you could try, but like it's nuanced. It's a constant negotiation. It's delicate. You know, we're made of people, and we have to work with people every day, and those challenges exist from the minute you wake up, the minute you go to bed, and probably in your dreams too. You know. So I think that this kind of, in this age of cancel culture and burn it down and is documented and be canceled forever and, you know, all of these things. And the truth is, like, we have to figure it out and work together. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I want to kind of continue in that idea of, like, I'm always about network building, about collaboration, because that's how you build something. And people are working on things that are similar to you, but maybe they've done something like that's a great model and you can bring it in. And also, I mean, I wanted just to note also, if there's something that you really, really feel should happen, like, you should just try to do it. So, like, I was just thinking, like, we're working on a decolonizing curatorial museum and public humanities project right now at Rutgers, but it's really like a bunch of colleagues that collaborate with each other, and we know our research, and we're networked together, and then network internationally, and we're just going to do it because we need to do it, right?
Yeah. I'll just pick up with that with our last question to end on a more hopeful note. Can you please address how there might be more shows that speak to the links, political networks among BIPOC artists, you know, rather than just mono-ethnic shows? So, yes, can you please address how there might be more shows, or what might be there more possibilities that speak to the links, political networks, and other connections that exist among BIPOC artists rather than mono-ethnic shows?
I'll just say, from my point of view, this is kind of a compilation of humanistic modes of thinking, meaning that as a student, you're not just taking art history classes, but you're taking comparative literature, you're taking sociology, you're taking world histories, and there's a tiling on that you as a thinker need to do in terms of the various discourses you're learning to create a social history. Because what I've noticed is that we all want to stay in our lane. It's kind of like the mall at the Smithsonian, right? With the various kinds of institutions that are devoted to a monolithic sense of identity. And to me, that is, it's wonderful. There needs to be those kinds of institutions, but that encourages, as I was saying in my talk, a very flattened sense of who we are as human beings. I mean, hearing Chitra talk yesterday about the ways in which her collaborations go across so many kinds of communities and issues of social justice is just one example. For me, what I am emphasizing as a curator is the ways in which social histories can be constructed across disciplines, and then using a particular social history that you as a curator develop, and then creating a checklist that supports it. It's not easy.
I just think that also, like, in terms of artists, I mean, they're just layered lives. I mean, it's not one specific thing that they're only part of. So it's just natural that, you know, their circle of artist friends or thinkers that they're with. I mean, it's a naturally enmeshed art history, and that's the way that we should actually be teaching. I mean, that's something that bothers me as well in terms of, like, oh, you're going to teach Latin American art history, and you're going to teach, and it's mostly when we think about the history of the U.S. and how it's linked globally as well, but just the third world movement and all of that. And it's just an enmeshed history. That's what it is, right? So, but then at the same time, like thinking about these particular initiatives, for example, there's a need for that still because there hasn't been money for it and there hasn't been collecting. So we need that too, right?
Yes.
I don't know if this is relevant, but a show like Black American Portraits, just to point out that not all the artists were Black. Sure. That the artists who were not had shown their allyship for many years, like Rafa Esparza's portrait of Patrisse Cullors, Kathy Opie's portrait of Kamala Harris, Lee Jaffe's portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat. He's taken the most amazing photographs historically of Peter Tosh and Bob Marley and a number of reggae artists in Jamaica. Glenn Kaino, Japanese-American artist in Los Angeles, 2 portraits of Tommy Smith, who won the gold medal in 1969 Olympics in Mexico City and is famous for the raised fist from that Olympics. So all of these artists and a few others really in their own work historically in their careers, and not just happens to be that one picture, that one painting, so that this kind of allyship, in working with artists as a curator, I think is important to kind of interrogate, but also be very, very intentional and be very specific and be very careful, I think, around consideration of what the kind of exhibition is and what the kind of wider parameters and what you were thinking about in that instance.
Sure. Well, I think that in thinking about what artists do and continue to do, is a great place to conclude the panel portion of IMU UR2, Art, Aesthetics in Asian America. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please remember to stick around, that at 7:30 is our keynote event at Bing Concert Hall. Okay, Kathy Park Hong, Jen Liu, and Marcy Kwan. The fun continues. Go get something to eat, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of hours.